As an independent journalist in Chicago, Jamie Kalven helped to force Chicago city officials to publicly release dashcam video showing the October 2014 shooting of Laquan McDonald, a teenager armed with a folding knife. His reporting on the incident challenged law enforcement's narrative and led to the indictment and ultimate conviction of Jason Van Dyke, the officer who shot McDonald 16 times. Jamie will discuss the repercussions of the shooting and the verdict on police reform, racial justice, and Chicago politics. Some of you may remember that Jamie spoke here about 3 years ago in February 2016 about a new era of police reform after his reporting was out, after the Slate article 16 Shots, but prior to the trial. And we're really, really lucky to have him back today. Jamie Kalven is executive director of the Invisible Institute, a journalism production company on the south side of Chicago, whose mission is to enhance the capacity of citizens to hold public institutions accountable. A writer and human rights activist, Jamie's work has appeared in a variety of publications, and in recent years he's reported extensively on patterns of police abuse and impunity in Chicago. In fact, his reporting on patterns of police abuse at Stateway Gardens in 2005 to 2006 gave rise to a federal civil rights suit, Bond versus Utreus, that figured centrally in the public debate over police reform in Chicago. His articles became the focus of a protracted legal controversy when he refused to comply with a subpoena from the city of Chicago demanding his notes. After the threat of contempt receded, Jamie intervened in the case and requested that various documents produced in the course of discovery by the Chicago Police Department under a protective order be made public, ultimately pursuing the documents in state court under the Illinois Freedom of Information Act. In March 2014, the Illinois Appellate Court ruled in Kalven versus Chicago that documents bearing on allegations of police misconduct are public information. The ruling has been hailed by civil rights lawyers as a historic and a watershed. Among the awards that Kalven has received are the 2015 George Polk Award for Local Reporting, the 2016 Ridenour Courage Prize, and the 2017 Hillman Prize for Web Journalism. As I was preparing this introduction, I ran across a November 2017 New York Times article about a subpoena Jamie faced in the pretrial phase of the Van Dyke trial. It was later quashed by a judge, as was another subpoena just a few weeks ago, compelling him to testify about his sources in the case where 3 Chicago police officers now face charges for allegedly conspiring to obstruct justice. In that New York Times article, I was struck by the closing paragraphs, where Jamie talked about his concern for the then forthcoming Van Dyke trial, which was expected to consume the city, and indeed it did. He noted that the release of the video of Laquan McDonald's death was a trauma for many Chicagoans and a window into police conduct. He said, quote, "I sort of feel like when you swim across a body of water and you can't see either shore. We're in the middle of a large historic thing. We could end up in a worse place rather than a better place." Well, today we'll hear his reflections on that truly historic trial and verdict and his assessment of what kind of a place we've ended up. Welcome, Jamie Kalven.
Thank you. That was great. I am delighted to be here, and I have fond memories of having been here 3 years ago. I think what I'd like to try to provide today, coming off that great introduction, is some sense of perspective of where we are in the midst of a large historic process that really took off in the aftermath of the Laquan McDonald implosion. After the video came out and other revelations, it really changed the terms of existence in the city, changed the political landscape, and created a situation that continues and in some ways deepens and intensifies, that is both perilous and full of promise. So I've worked on these issues for decades, and I think I can honestly say that I never expected in my lifetime for there to be an opening for really fundamental and enduring change with respect to the core undefined issues in American life, with respect to racial justice that we have in Chicago right now. And the ultimate paradox is that this moment exists in the midst of the progressive collapse of our republic at the national level. But it's, you know, I think it's really critically important to understand where we are as a city, and by extension, the society more broadly, and to work hard to have a kind of clear diagnosis of the nature of the problems and what's really demanded of us as individual citizens and associations of citizens. So really my theme today, as I reflected on this occasion, is on what we mean when we talk about police accountability, but also how that notion of accountability and personal responsibility extends beyond the police, and what are our roles and opportunities at a historic inflection point as citizens. And I think maybe the image of being in a big body of water and not being able to see either shore is completely apt. And a lot has happened. There's been a really interesting and rich history that's brought us to this point. And there are a spectrum of possibilities of, you know, alternative scenarios going forward. But maybe the place to start is in the middle of the story with the two trials that have recently occurred. So the Laquan McDonald incident and its public meanings now constitute, I think it's fair to say, the kind of framing narrative of our civic life. You know, beyond anything I could ever have expected when I first heard the name Laquan McDonald within a week or 10 days after the incident, from a whistleblower in law enforcement, and began investigating the case. I could never ever have imagined that story of the fate of that one child would assume the proportions it has in our common civic life in Chicago. And I think the only possible analogy that occurs to me, or historical parallel, is the story of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old, another child of Chicago in the Jim Crow South, lynched, tortured, mutilated, murdered, and the way in which, in the run-up to the civil rights movement of the 60s, the Emmett Till story became a kind of portal. You know, first there's the appalling atrocity, but beyond that, it becomes a kind of opening into underlying conditions and pathologies that give rise to that kind of violence. And I think the Laquan McDonald story has proved to be similar. So it's a window, a portal into systemic conditions that give rise to state violence against people of color, and to, you know, grotesque human rights violations. That's the big the big conversation we've been having in the city, and all the different inquiries into the underlying pathologies within the criminal justice system. The trial of Officer Jason Van Dyke was fascinating in part because all of that was excluded from the trial. The trial was stripped of all of that context, you know, the larger diagnostic stuff about the nature of the police, the relationship to various communities in the city, our political culture. It was stripped down to the narrow question of, did Officer Van Dyke murder Laquan McDonald? So it was a classic murder trial that the judge, who was a formidable character, who, you know, as was noted, I tangled with early in the trial and confronted with a subpoena, and I thought at the time was a kind of imperious, and my lawyers were just completely unnerved. Very seasoned lawyers told me afterwards, after the sort of ultimate moment in court where I was either going to go to jail, be taken into custody, and be held for contempt of court, or he was going to quash the subpoena. My lawyers told me after, we've never been more nervous, just because you're not dealing with law, you're dealing with the temperament of the judge. That's sort of the gravitational field you're operating. In fact, against that background, I have to say that he managed the trial masterfully. This is a trial that could easily have gotten out of hand. I mean, think of something like the O.J. Simpson trial. You know, you could have had a media circus and all sorts of turbulence in the courtroom. So he was very controlling of it, but I think to a good end. But the form it took strategically was just to strip away anything that didn't bear on the question of, did person X murder person Y? And I'm sure, you know, as most people in Chicago, you follow the trial and the run-up to the verdict. I was in the courtroom throughout, which was really fascinating, and the press corps was there. You know, there were dozens of reporters. And as the trial advanced, because it's this narrow murder case, the only question is the question of the responsibility of this one officer. And as the trial advanced, there was this feeling once the possibility of second-degree murder was, it was initially the charge was first-degree murder, and then 16 counts of aggravated battery with a firearm. So each of the bullets was a crime, and I'll come back to that. And it was a matter of the defense asking for second-degree murder. Once second-degree murder was a possibility, it felt like everything was kind of flowing towards that outcome. And second-degree murder, interestingly, involves you have to prove all the elements of first-degree murder, and then what allows for the possibility of second-degree murder are mitigating factors. And the mitigating factor in this case would be the sincere belief that Laquan McDonald represented an imminent threat of grave harm. The belief could be wrong, but a sincere belief, which interestingly, just as a side note, allows for the possibility of racism on Jason Van Dyke's part, that he saw a threat from a black teenager, a presumption of danger, a presumption of guilt. And the jury could allow for that possibility, and that was never made explicit, but I think it was probably part of the thinking of the jury. The people experienced this, I think, on the radio and watching, because I know I was in the courtroom, and there was the entire, some of you will be familiar with 26 in California, Cook County Courthouse in Chicago, huge monolithic building, I don't know how many courtrooms. It was apparent that the jury had reached a verdict and was going to be announced, they emptied the entire courtroom, the entire building. So the only people who were there were in that courtroom and the press. Everything else was, and all over the city, there were, all sorts of institutions were making preparations for, civil disorder if the jury went sideways, if it was an acquittal or a hung jury. And I think it was a very strange, in retrospect, a very strange mix of prudence and racism. It's just really bizarre when you think about it. But there were people. I know of one Walgreens where they had a plan that they were going to barricade the employees were going to barricade themselves in the store, and all sorts of institutions were, big corporations downtown, little community mom and pop stores, were assuming, Rodney King type conflagration would happen. I never felt that was a possibility. And if you remember the inspired there would have surely been mass demonstrations, but I think it was a more volatile moment when the video was released, and in November of 2015, and what followed from that was inspired demonstrations. If you remember the Black Friday demonstrations on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. So that energy got expressed through sort of classic political expression, and there was no violence. In any case, in the run-up to the jury verdict, all this tension throughout the city, and certainly everybody's focused on what would happen. And in the courtroom, it was quite incredible. The completely silent courtroom, and there's a sense in which a trial is it's like theater. It is like a stage, and there are protagonists, and there's conflict, and there's suspense, and there's drama. And it was also true in the gallery, which was filled, well, on one hand, there was Jason Van Dyke's family was there on a daily basis, his wife, his father, often his mother, his priest, and similarly members of Jason Van Dyke's family, of Laquan McDonald's family, a number of prominent African-American ministers were often in court, Black Lives Matter activists, representatives of the Fraternal Order of Police, and other police officers. So you have this amazing, in a very intimate space, you have this amazing mix of people with different perspectives on these issues and on this case. And when it came time to read the verdict, it was read by the clerk of the court, middle-aged African-American woman, considerable dignity, stood up and read the verdict. And it was an extraordinary moment. I don't know how it was experienced outside the courtroom, but it was an extraordinary moment. And what was particularly extraordinary and very powerful for me is, I had the article in Slate that broke the story. I had titled 16 Shots, which is kind of interesting why 16 Shots became such resonant. I mean, it's sort of mysterious because everybody's shot a certain number of times. And something about 16 shots, so, I titled it 16 Shots, and then pretty soon young activists were shouting, that became the chant, 16 shots and a cover-up is what was, and countless demonstrations was the chant. There's a young hip-hop artist I've come to know, Vic Mensa, who had a big success. He was inspired less by me than by the kids in the street, and did a composition called 16 Shots with a very compelling video. But the ultimate rendering of the music of 16 Shots was the clerk of the court reading the verdict. First count, second-degree murder, guilty. And then the 16 counts of aggravated battery with a firearm. It was just overwhelmingly powerful, overwhelmingly powerful. And I'm dwelling on that moment because it was so dramatic. This is unprecedented to have an officer convicted of murder for an on-duty act of violence. And at the same time, it's just so important not to, or to be careful about what we take away from the case and what we take away from the verdict. So we're not all better. We're not healed. We haven't, fixed a broken city through that verdict. I think where its importance resides is, imagine if it had gone the other way. I think that it's not that people would have rioted, I'm quite sure, but it would have just sort of underwritten people's despair. It would have, any hope of meaningful change, I think, at least in the communities most affected by this sort of violence, would have been severely, severely retarded. It's already so tenuous, it's so hard for people to believe that it could be different this time. that there actually could be meaningful and even transformative change. So what was really important about the trial and the outcome of the trial, in my mind, has to do with civic morale and just the sense that it's an entertainable possibility over. It'll take years and lots of work by lots of people, and we all need to sort of elevate our games to accomplish it. But at least that it's an entertainable possibility that things could be different. And so the trial had that symbolic importance, and we'll see what degree of sort of practical importance as a change, engendering change in how the police behave. The second trial, which just concluded, the prosecution and the defense have both rested. The second trial is in some ways potentially more consequential in terms of contributing to change and sort of shifting the incentive-disincentive structure for officers. It's a conspiracy trial charging 3 officers out of many who have been named and investigated in connection with the so-called cover-up of the Laquan McDonald murder. They're charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice and official misconduct. And it's problematic that it's only these 3 and not higher ups, but it's still, as the press has often said, unprecedented. And so what's being addressed in the trial is the so-called code of silence within the department. And it's, again, been an altogether sort of fascinating process. And now we're talking about, if the first trial was solely about the responsibility of one person, Jason Van Dyke, for the murder of Laquan McDonald, this trial is exploring larger notions of responsibility for the so-called cover-up. I contest that for reasons I'll describe in a minute, that formulation, but it's really about the machinery that makes cases like this disappear and has so many times made them disappear, and generates false narratives about what happened that are built out of lies, but we rarely call them that. And so it's raising a much, much larger and more fundamental set of issues. And think about just the relative importance of it. Police shoot civilians, almost always people of color, too often. Having said that, it's still an extraordinarily rare event. Something like the Laquan McDonald shooting is a really rare event. It's egregious and grave and the worst thing that happens, but really rare. Police lie all the time, in terms of just a set of cultural practices within the police department that years and years ago, I had a sort of a pen pal with one of the most corrupt officers in Chicago history, a guy named Gerry Finnegan, who was the head of the Special Operations Section that imploded in around 2006. And he's towards the end of a 12-year sentence as a result of that. And at that point, he was being held in jail before he went to penitentiary. And we had some, back and forth. And he would talk about creative writing and the power of the pen in terms of what policemen do and what police officers do in generating coherent narratives about what happened with mutually reinforcing statements. So, what we saw in the Laquan McDonald case was the power of the pen being deployed to falsify something that we ultimately saw the realities of in the video. So these officers are charged with, I mean, the heart of the case is that they filed false reports about what happened that suggested that Laquan McDonald was the assailant. The officers were defending themselves. It was a matter of self-defense. And what's been really fascinating about this case is, so I've written a great deal about the Code of Silence, and if you're interested, there's actually a piece I've published at the end of 2016 in a publication called The Intercept, and I've done a lot of writing for The Intercept recently. It's called The Code of Silence, and it's sort of a novella-length article about two whistleblower police officers who tried to expose corruption and wrongdoing within the department and suffered terrible retaliation for it. And it also talks about the underlying corruption they were reporting, and it's a big case that keeps getting bigger, so it might be of interest. But it's a sort of dramatizes what we mean by the Code of Silence, but it's one of those terms that's problematic. So it is a phenomena of silence. Officers fear to speak out, fear to break ranks because of the consequences, the kind of retaliation that can rain down on them. But that's a kind of half-truth, and it also obscures something fundamental about the nature of the problem, which is it's really a narrative. It's a matter of narrative control and storytelling rather than of silence. So if you think about the police department as this kind of narrative machinery, and that narrative machinery kicked into motion the moment Laquan McDonald hit the ground. As the boy was bleeding out on the ground, it began. Taking narrative control of the situation. We even have, I co-produced a feature documentary about the Laquan McDonald case that'll show early next year on Showtime. And we have an exchange between one of the officers on the scene and the radio dispatcher. And the dispatcher asks, what's the condition of the victim? And the officer on the scene says, offender. And the woman back, on the radio says, that's what I meant. That's what I meant. That's the beginning of the narrative forming. It begins immediately. And then it requires all sorts of different kinds of interventions. So there were civilian witnesses at the scene, drivers who had been stopped by the police. Immediately they are shooed away by officers without taking contact information or statements. These are witnesses to a homicide, and they're pushed away from the scene. There were two witnesses who were outspoken, and one of whom, a truck driver, said that was an execution, and they were taken to Area Central, to nearby police headquarters, held for 3.5 hours, and browbeaten by, it wasn't an interrogation or an interview of a witness, it was like trying to re-educate them. It's telling them, you cannot have seen what you think you saw. We have video that contradicts it. This is within, an hour of the shooting, and they're invoking the video to try to unsettle witness testimony. The falsification of reports, people saying that he was an assailant, that he lunged towards the officers, the other officers, making statements that would justify the shooting. And this continues up the food chain, to the mayor and the mayor's office, and everybody pushing a narrative in a certain direction. To call that a cover-up, I mean, I've said often in interviews and public comments about this, I wish it were a cover-up. You know, had it been a cover-up, you know, classic, think Nixon and Watergate. You know, you have a few conspiratorial bad actors, and they do something they know is wrong, and then they compound the wrong by suppressing or falsifying information, and that's not what this was. This was actually standard operating procedure. This was the way the machinery works. And maybe just to imaginatively think about it, how this works, and this really relates to my theme of what we mean by accountability and personal responsibility, is there's in any given 24-hour rotation, there's a senior police official, a deputy chief, who is, I think the term is the on-duty incident commander. So, you know, at any given moment, there's a single person high in the police hierarchy who is on call, should there be an incident like the Laquan McDonald, or it could be, you know, a mass shooting or some event that requires immediate intervention from a senior official. And so when the audience, you know, the more informal term is the street chief. So when the street chief comes to something like the scene of the Laquan McDonald shooting, and I mean, there's a little bit of novelistic imagination in this, but I've done lots of interviews with people in similar situations. It's pretty clear to me that they don't come to investigate in the sense of figuring out what happened. They come to figure out how to justify what happened. It's a really important distinction. They come to figure out how to justify what happened. And they do that out of, often, I think, out of a sense of duty and fidelity to the institution. They do it for the good of the institution. And I mean, that's the narrative that somebody has in their mind. That's a very different phenomena. That's a very, very different phenomena from the cover-up. You know we did something wrong. We're gonna make it go away. This is a machinery but think by extension of other institutions. Think about the dynamic within the Catholic Church. Think about all the people who covered up, horrible crimes with the sentiment that they were doing it for the Mother Church. Corporate crime, similar. There are all sorts of patterns, and there's been some work, similar to my work on police departments, done with medical research fraud within universities, within institutions supposedly dedicated to the pursuit of truth. So I think there's a larger issue here across. There's a field that doesn't yet exist of thinking about accountability across institutions, and it actually is, for an ethical society. I mean, these seem to me to be really, really fundamental questions that I'm now grappling with and trying to write about this, and the legal system is grappling with, because that kind of sort of bureaucratic phenomena that, and I think it's right to think of it as bureaucratic, so all sorts of individual actors within a larger structure. And it doesn't require, our notions of evil require so often, or at least our imaginative purchase on evil in the world, requires that there be evil people or a demonic kind of conspiracy that we can identify and we can sort of personalize. And I think what our reality is so often, there are people out in the world with broken chromosomes who don't know that other people exist. There's that form of evil, but relatively rare. This other process of a sort of bureaucratic dynamic where you have all these individual actors who are acting kind of locally and in isolation, and in the aggregate, it produces outcomes that can be catastrophic and can warrant being described as evil. We don't really have a language or legal concepts that are adequate to that dynamic. And there's a weird way in which responsibility gets dispersed in a system like that. So I talk a lot to police officers, and they almost always say the same thing about some of these larger issues. They say, it's above my pay grade. It's above my pay grade. That's almost always the thing that they say. And and then you have people in more senior positions who are saying, yes, this is, their internal dialogue is, their internal, conversation with themselves is, yes, this, whatever it is deplorable, but the department can't take another scandal. Or, so for the benefit of this institution that I'm pledged to. And those things in combination create, as I say, outcomes that deserve to be called evil, but people don't feel a sense of personal responsibility and accountability. I was struck, you may have seen in the paper in the last day or two, that James Mattis, the defense secretary, apparently is furious over the internal investigation within the Pentagon of the incident in Niger where several officers, because they're only looking at kind of the rank and file. Those are the only people who are being held accountable. And so he at this, his high level is saying, where's the accountability up the food chain? And I think that's what we've been missing so much in our political life. This is where leadership really matters. This is where leadership and institutions really matter. So these issues now are in play in the conspiracy case that was concluded last week, and it's a bench trial, so the judge will render a verdict. The judge will render a verdict, I think, on December 19th, she said, so a couple of weeks. And what's been both unnerving and fascinating for me, I'm not predicting the outcome. I think they could easily be acquitted, but they could also be convicted. What's been fascinating in court has been just the sense that as the law tries to capture this larger bureaucratic phenomena and assign responsibility and ultimately guilt, it's as if the whole thing sort of disintegrates and turns to dust. So it comes down to, when you just look at it, this officer's responsibility and this officer's role, it becomes a question of, well, he ticked this box rather than another box on a form. And at that point, where it's not seen as part of the larger culture, the larger machinery, the defense is always available to say, well, maybe I made a mistake, or it's open to interpretation. At that point, it just has all kind of turned to dust. So what in fact is this powerful gravitational field where everybody kind of knows their de facto job descriptions, and all the so-called errors that get made are all in the same direction, all reinforce the official narrative, the official false narrative of what happened in a case like the Laquan McDonald case, are legal concepts, and particularly notions of conspiracy. Conspiracy, which is what this trial is about, conspiracy requires an agreement. Well, if it's a culture and everybody knows what's expected of them, they don't have to conspire. They don't have to conspire for that outcome. And so the really, I'm still guardedly hopeful that the verdict will be a step in the right direction, but the trial is fascinating in any case. And so you have this phenomena which is, the more pervasive it is, the more elusive it is to actually name it, identify it. And I think that presents an ethical and a moral dilemma for all of us that is huge, and that, as I say, cuts across institutions, cuts across institutions. I mean, I'll close in a minute because I want to have time for back and forth, but I think the question I want to leave you with is sort of what are our responsibilities in what's it mean to take responsibility? I sort of have one version of that, but I also have a role and a set of tools as a journalist. So, my job description is to interrogate the official narrative and where it's false to try to demonstrate that. But I think there's, a larger question for all of us. And I think in some ways it's dramatized, that question, and in some ways it's obscured by the amazing and appalling and farcical drama that's playing out at the national level. So, we have a president and people around him who, to an astonishing degree, are, I think, incapable of telling the truth. Even to call it lying doesn't really capture the dynamic. And we're seeing more and more of that from day to day. But it would be a mistake, I think, because that's so dramatic and boldly defined, to think that that's the problem, when I think we could look at every institution, and certainly institutions of government, and or at least I would urge you to entertain this thought, that power imposes itself. One of the major ways power imposes itself is through narrative, through the story it tells about the nature of the institution, about particular incidents, a case, and about the world we live in. And a huge amount of energy. I mean, if you're in the position I've been in my career of pushing back at official narratives, it's almost a visceral sensation of the power of all that gets invested in false narratives by government. And certainly with the Laquan McDonald case, they kept doubling down on a false narrative as pressure built and built, and it just ultimately blew up the machinery, completely cratered the Emanuel administration. But that was only because there had been such an investment in a set of falsehoods. So maybe I'll stop there, but leave in the air, and maybe we can talk more about the question of sort of personal responsibility. If there's anything plausible in what I'm saying about the nature of serious, ongoing societal evils, having this quality of a sort of culture people operate in. The one very admirable whistleblowing police officer once said to me, what's so hard for people to understand is that the code of silence for police officers is like this ringing in your ears that is always there from the moment you enter the academy to when you retire. It's a powerful image. We can't hear it. Those of us who aren't within that culture don't hear it, but it's a ringing, it's just a constant presence that operating within that gravitational field. And so we have, the police are a dramatic instance, but I think by no means the only example of this. We have a situation, let's just stay with the police for a moment, but I urge you to extrapolate beyond to other institutions, where people have to be heroes, have to be heroic to the point of martyrdom to just tell the truth as they see it, or to behave decently as they see it. And that's a seriously screwed up situation. There used to be said of the Soviet Union under sort of totalitarian regime that people had to be heroes to be decent. And I think we should at least pose that as a question to ourselves. That's not a healthy society. Those aren't healthy institutions where people have to be prepared to risk everything and sacrifice everything simply to tell the truth. Anyway, I appreciate your attention and would love to hear questions, challenges, thoughts.
Hello, my name's Terry. I have two questions. One is perhaps something you've come across in your... Okay, I'll do this one first. You may have run across it in your research for some reason, but I'm curious if you have any idea what the city's liability has been or what the city's had to pay out due to actions like police misconduct and wrongful death.
So the Better Government Association did the math a few years ago, and at that point, for the previous decade, it was $500 million in settlements and awards. I can't remember for sure whether that included legal costs, both in-house and stuff they farm out to other lawyers. It's grown dramatically since then, so I would probably venture that over the last 15 years, it would be at $750 million. But I think the one other thing I would add to that is those are monetary costs. The real costs are almost incalculable in terms of whole communities that are alienated from civil authority, and with good reason, patterns of retaliatory violence that take hold because people don't trust the police, and so essentially take the law into their own hands, seeking a kind of rough justice. So and just what those patterns, which happen in some neighborhoods and not in other neighborhoods, say to people about their role in the society and their standing in the society. So the monetary costs are shocking, but they're a fraction of the real costs.
Thanks for a great talk. I was wondering if you see any other cities that you think might be a model, or if this is so pervasive that there's nowhere really where things are working well?
Good question. It's pretty pervasive. So urban, there are similar patterns in big urban police departments with large, in cities with large African American populations. I think probably the one shining example of really significant reform is Los Angeles. Los Angeles is completely out of control. You had the Rodney King moment, and then what was called the Rampart Scandal, and similar to some of the stuff we've dealt with in Chicago, where an elite team of gang tactical officers were an integral part of the drug trade, and were involved in all sorts of criminal activity. And that was a process. The reforms in LA were a process of well over a decade, and they're not. Nothing is ever permanent, in the sense that the struggle continues, but there were a couple of elements there that have not been present in Chicago. They may yet be present. One is that the LA Times played a very central role, and this ongoing process over years and years of police reform was almost daily on the front page, and reporters did a lot of original reporting. And that just hasn't been the case in Chicago. I mean, it's a different era in terms of media, so there's the kind of fragility of media, but a lot of my reputation as a journalist really hinges on all the stories that major media in Chicago leave to me to cover, because they don't cover. They really should. Kara referred to the legal case that arose out of my reporting, Kalven versus Chicago, that broke down the wall of secrecy around police disciplinary records. In a rational universe, that would be Chicago Tribune versus City of Chicago, right? So we have a deficiency there. And then the other thing that LA had is the police superintendent through the critical period of reform was William Bratton, who had been the police commissioner in New York, and is by pretty much universal acknowledgement seen as the most effective police executive in the country. So leadership really, really matters. it really matters. And a lot of this stuff is just a matter of professionalism on the part of the police, but you need to have the kind of leadership that demands that and doesn't tolerate less than that. And we haven't had that. Maybe we will going forward, but we haven't had it.
Hi, so I'm trying to find out more about COPA, specifically if you have any opinions on it, and how it compares to other efforts on Chicago's part to have more police accountability, and specifically those failed efforts.
So COPA, for those who don't know, is the Citizen Office of Police Accountability, Civilian Office of Police Accountability, and we have had since the 80s now a succession of 3 different agencies tasked with investigating police shootings, excessive force, and racial verbal abuse. And the first was the Office of Professional Standards, OPS, and in the mid-2000s, the Special Operations Scandal broke, and not only was that unit within the police department disbanded, but OPS was changed to IPRA, the Independent Police Review Authority. So each time there's a scandal, there's a kind of alphabet soup of changing acronyms for an agency that has essentially the same functions. In the post-Laquan McDonald moment, IPRA, which had proved inadequate in various ways, was reconstituted as COPA, and I've actually done trainings at COPA for their staff, and I'm rooting for them. I know quite well the former head of it, Sharon Fairley, who was highly effective, and it's complicated. It's hard, and what they were tasked with was sort of shutting down an agency that had been discredited, and ramping up and opening the doors of an agency that would have credibility, performing much the same functions, and without the luxury of closing their doors while they did it. So one of the things, and I urge this on my team and on other journalists, somebody like me doing the kind of investigative reporting I do, my reporting, I'm not hunting for scalps like some journalists, but my reporting necessarily does damage to the legitimacy of institutions, exposing wrongdoing and dysfunction. I believe that we as reporters have an equal responsibility to report on the process by which institutions like COPA hopefully regenerate legitimacy. That seems to me to be a really important subject. The jury's still out on COPA. They're trying really hard. They have various kind of constraints. They exist in a larger institutional ecosystem that constrains them in some ways. But that's sort of what reform looks like, is small granular improvements. And if I can expand a little on that, I think one of the things that is challenging in terms of civic morale and citizen engagement with processes like this is that it's all kind of these small concrete things, intervention here, a tweak in procedures there, a reconstituting of an agency. That's what reform is. And it's a long slog, and it's not particularly thrilling in itself, but it's critical, and it's critical that there be citizens who are knowledgeable, engaged, who are monitoring the process, who are supportive of advances in it. And I think that kind of goes against human nature in some ways, in that when we come to comprehend profound harms, when we look through the window of the Laquan McDonald case to the conditions that allowed that to happen, or the Emmett Till case, pardon me, when we as human beings have those moments of recognizing how grave and profound the harms are, I think there's a natural desire and hunger for remedies that are commensurate with the harms. So when my young friends in the Black Lives Matter movement call for the abolition of the police, I think that's an example of that. You know, the feeling that this is so terrible, there needs to be some big transformative thing. My own view is that those big transformative things just aren't on the menu. They're not available, and what is available is the long slog of intervening here, and things that taken together can change cultures and systems, but none of which are going to be particularly thrilling or inspiring or transformative in themselves. And the example I always give in that context is, you know, we recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of Selma, and one of the things that Dr. King and his associates were brilliant at was telling the story and dramatizing the story of reform, making the reform process a narrative in which we as citizens felt we had a stake and we participated. But Selma was actually about the Voting Rights Act. And if you look at the Voting Rights Act, it's very granular. You know, it's about removing various bars to enfranchisement, literacy tests, and, you know, other kinds of things that are just designed to discourage African Americans from voting. And I think police reform is like that. And what we've lacked is the kind of leadership that tells the story of reform in a way that makes the details of COPA, and I really, again, appreciate the question, interesting and important to people.
Hi. I know there was this report, or this investigation and report after Laquan McDonald. I'm not sure who did the study, but do you feel like it's going to have any kind of impact, or?
Yeah, so one thing I haven't mentioned is in the aftermath of the Laquan McDonald revelations, so, you know, you had the atrocity itself, but then everything that came out about the falsification of the reality. And a couple of things happened. One is that the mayor appointed a, what was it called? The Police Accountability Task Force. And it was under the leadership of Lori Lightfoot, who's now running for mayor. And a bunch of good people, but, you know, a lot of skepticism about what that was going to prove to be. We've had Mayor Daley, the second, was always doing this. There's a scandal, and you appoint a blue ribbon committee, and then people's attention goes somewhere else. So it becomes a kind of scandal management that doesn't lead to real reform. This group, really, their report is very good and was impactful and exceeded expectations. And then parallel with that, the Department of Justice intervened in Chicago under the Obama administration, and over 13 months produced a report which, alas, was released on the eve of Trump's inauguration, that is the most extensive and searching report the Department of Justice has ever done on a police investigation of a police department, and it's worth looking at. It's really well crafted. My team worked with them some in the course of it. And so we have really rich, rigorous, evidence-based diagnosis of the condition of the police department and related agencies. And I won't go into all the details of this, so it's a fascinating story. There now is, and I think before the end of the year this will happen, there is about to be a consent decree, so-called, entered in Federal District Court in Chicago. And a consent decree would have been the outcome if we had a different outcome of the national election. When the Justice Department intervenes, you know, they basically, it's like bringing a lawsuit against the city, and then the settlement of the lawsuit, and the lawsuit, you know, alleges pattern and practice of constitutional violations by the police department. The settlement of the lawsuit takes the form of a consent decree. So think of it as a settlement between parties that then lays out and commits the city to a set of reforms. So it becomes a blueprint for reform. Despite the Trump withdrawal from any oversight of police departments at the federal level, there was a sort of class action, citizen-driven consent decree process that then was sort of entered into by Lisa Madigan, the Attorney General in Illinois, that has in fact now advanced to the point where it's about to be entered. So there will be this kind of blueprint for reform with the enforcement hammer of a federal judge overseeing it, and a police monitor will be appointed, which is basically a team of subject matter experts who will monitor and kind of oversee the reform process. This again goes to the importance of citizen engagement with these issues and being informed about them and looking for points to where citizen involvement is critical. Everything that's happened, looking back from the middle of this big body of water, everything constructive that's happened in this process has been driven by civil society, by, people in the streets, by the exposures by journalists, by lawyers bringing various kinds of suits. And I think it's critical going forward that we hold on to that perception. If we're going to realize the moment that's at hand in Chicago, it's going to take not just sustaining the level of citizen engagement we have right now, but significantly increasing it. This is a political process, ultimately. And one of the dangers with the consent decree, and it would have been true had there been a different outcome to the election and continuity in the Justice Department. One of the dangers now is that people will say, okay, the experts are now managing police reform. And that would be to sacrifice an opportunity, as I say, that is extraordinary and historic. But it depends on us. It depends on citizens feeling personally responsible. One of the things in our mission statement at the Invisible Institute is the organization I'm associated with and founded, and I really took this language from Solidarity in Poland and from Václav Havel and others in Czechoslovakia in the 90s, the sort of civil society activists, human rights activists in Central Europe. They had a way of talking that we've adopted, and what we say is that we as citizens take co-responsibility with the state for ensuring that human rights are respected and that violations are addressed. And I would urge that notion of co-responsibility. It's built into what a democracy is. A functioning democracy is one where we're self-governing. We're far from that at the moment, but we have opportunities, and particularly in Chicago with respect to fundamental issues, to regenerate democratic norms and practices and principles from the ground up, and to do it with respect to fundamentally important issues. And the issues, police reform, to talk about police reform or police accountability is a kind of sterile and antiseptic way to talk about what we're really engaged in here. We're dealing with the great unfinished business in American life with respect to racial justice under law. That's what this is about.
I heard you speak earlier this fall, and in that talk, you commented when you were talking about this, how vast the sea is and how vast the institutional interconnections are, that, for instance, we had to keep in mind that the police are only, they're major, but, yeah. And so you talked about the corruption of judges. Yeah. And I think that's a kind of challenging notion for a lot of people. So I was wondering if you would expand on that, how
Sure.
it happens, kind of in a process way.
Yeah, so, our work sort of fatefully, but also just trying to proceed step by step, has been centrally focused on the police and on police accountability, but the police exist in a larger institutional landscape. And one of the things that has become clearer to us, my team and other collaborators we work with in thinking about what the next phase of this work looks like, is it's really looking to map more fully that landscape, moving from where we are with the police. So we actually have started a project where we're working intensively with the Cook County Public Defender's Office, I've got a good relationship with Kim Fox, the state's attorney, and there already have been instances where Kim, in the Code of Silence story I wrote about, that I urge you to look at in The Intercept, there now have been 50 exonerations of people who were wrongfully convicted by this group of corrupt officers, and there are going to be many, many more. It'll be in the hundreds. And Kim Fox, the state's attorney's office, has said that there are 10 officers still on the force from this criminal cohort that they won't take cases from. They won't call to testify. So those officers are now radioactive. But think about so really the challenge, for a generation now, we've been talking about mass incarceration and the harms of mass incarceration. We've talked about it at this kind of macro level, the new Jim Crow kind of framing. What we're now in a position to do, and I think this is think of it as a truth and reconciliation project, and what we're in a position to do, and it's the agenda we're trying to contribute to going forward, is to begin to dismantle the machinery of mass incarceration, to look for ways to work with different cogs in that larger machinery to change the way they operate. Right now, I mean, there are all sorts of idealistic and weary and overworked people in the public defender's office, but very often public defenders are just an integral part of that machinery. They have somebody come who's got a complicated record. The person says, I was framed. These rogue cops planted the drugs on me. But they have no legal resources to really challenge those officers. And so they say, you got to cop a plea. You have to plead guilty, or because of your record, you're going to go away for a long, long time. That makes them an integral part of the system. So we're working to give them tools so that they can take their cell phone out, with the kind of data we have and the information we have, put in the name of, when they're making a first appearance with a client they've just met, put in the names of arresting officers. And if they're problematic officers, so say somebody's been arrested for resisting arrest or aggravated assault of a police officer, which are often cover charges after that somebody's been beaten up. And that officer in our database and our information has 15 excessive force complaints against them. That means in the first appearance, that lawyer can potentially challenge the credibility of the officer, something that's otherwise impossible. And then, it's sort of like creating this virtuous circle that goes from civil society, from the work that we and others do, to public defenders and the criminal defense bar, to prosecutors. The key is having the prosecutors say, we're not going to take we know these are bad cops, we're not going to take cases. And at that point, you're really putting leverage on judges, because if these other elements in the machinery are identifying problematic officers and not accepting their cases. So, it's harder to, we're not doing it, but other journalists are trying to figure out ways to do court watching and spend time in the courtrooms of judges known to be problems, and sort of document, because a lot of what happens, a lot of the injustice doesn't leave a paper trail, at 26 in California. Anyway, the key is just this sort of paradigm shift from thinking about the police in isolation to thinking about them as part of this larger machinery, and looking for ways to have information and quality reporting drive different kinds of outcomes. Right now, the machinery just works to sort of grind up people's lives.
All right, we have time for one last question. This is our last question, and I regret that I neglected to ask Jamie earlier, but do you happen to have time to stay afterwards for a cup of coffee, or do you need to scoot?
I can stay briefly.
Okay, so if you've got a burning question and I don't call on you, you'll have a minute to ask him for a cup of coffee afterwards. But let's have this be our last one.
Thank you. I stayed home and watched both trials. Couple of things bother me. One, okay. There were only 3 on trial. It seems to me there should be a lot more.
Yeah.
Everybody all the way up, including the mayor. To me, withholding that
Video, yeah.
Video. If that's not obstruction of justice, I don't know what is.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, and I didn't say much about the mayor. I think I know the mayor. When this case broke open, he started calling me. We've had a number of conversations, and he's an easy person to dislike, and lots of people dislike him for a variety of reasons. And I think in some ways that has confounded our understanding of the case, because he became a lightning rod for, and so the assumption of kind of cover up, and the truth is that the settlement with the family and that facilitated the withholding. I mean, the withholding of the video was, as I say, business as usual. We have an open investigation, and we can't release evidence until the investigation is completed. That is routine. Every police reporter will tell you that. It's changed now because of this case, but that's routine. The thing, and I have no doubt that there were calculations, especially as pressure built, about the impact on his election. But he was also just completely dispersed. I think the more interesting thing is, remember, I reported on this case, and then it got lots of attention. There was lots of secondary coverage in February of 2015. February of 2015, everything is out in the open. Civilian witnesses, the autopsy, the fact that there's video, all of that was reported in the piece I did February 10th. And so through the entire election season and then the runoff with Chuy Garcia, that information is out there. It's getting more and more attention. People in the street shouting 16 shots. And it wasn't just the mayor didn't address it. None of the other candidates did. Chuy Garcia didn't. His senior advisors are friends of mine. They had all this information. Everybody stayed away from it. The press, nobody asked the candidates about it. Nobody asked the mayor about it. This was in the open. It wasn't, it hadn't blown up to the degree it blew up with the release of the video. But, my piece got lots of attention. It stayed in the world. I won a slew of journalism awards. It was picked up by other reports. So this wasn't obscure. And so it was a larger failure of our political culture and our media culture. And I don't want to in any way absolve the mayor of his responsibility in all of this, but I think it's important to sort of see that. Now, interestingly, we're going to have a mayoral election campaign where we have Tony Preckwinkle running, Lori Lightfoot running, Gary McCarthy running, all of whom have perspectives on this. So these issues are going to be debated endlessly in the context of this election. They were completely silent in the previous election, which is, again, kind of a measure of how much has changed. But I think, I tend to see the mayor as part of this larger machinery. And I'm not so much defending him when I say that as just coming back to the point which has been central to my talk, which is that we need to focus and think hard about a larger culture of official denial and false narratives, and how what our responsibilities are to contest that. Thank you very much.